Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. Now that we've completed some of the basic setup chores, we want to focus on the heart of the application. No, it's not the media, it's actually the data model. This requires that we translate our low-tech mockup that we talked about in the previous lesson into a viable data model that best represents the data and the hierarchical relationships between the data. So our game plan in this lesson is to first of all briefly analyze our requirements. Really the mock-up is all that we have plus whatever we talked about in the last lesson or two. And we're going to quickly diagram a data model that we're going to implement in our app using C#. Then we're going to implement the data model in code, and we'll create some data in an XML file that will be used as design time data for the purpose of displaying something in our apps, in our main page's XAML designer. And then we're going to modify the main page.xaml's binding expressions to point to instances of classes and properties in our new data model that we're going to design right now. Okay. So after looking over the mock-ups and thinking about how best to delegate responsibilities to the various classes, I came up with a very basic model that's my first best guess at how to structure the data that I'm going to need for the app. And so you can see it here on screen as a UML or a class diagram. Essentially, there are three classes: a sound model class, a sound group class, and a sound data class. And notice that each of the properties in sound model are of type sound group. All right, so in other words, animals, cartoons, taunts, warnings, these are what I've been calling categories, which will eventually become pivot items that we can kind of browse through. So each of those items will have a title, which will be of type string, and then they'll also have a collection of items. And notice that collection is a list of type, or a list of T, and the T is sound data. So each sound data object will represent a tile that we'll be able to push on, and when the user pushes on it, and they'll be able to see what it is. So it'll be a meow or a quack or a bark or something like that. And then when they click on it, we'll use the file path property then to actually retrieve the file from one of our the audio folders, right, and to play the given WAV file that's associated with that object that we're clicking on. Okay. So again, the sound group represents what I've been calling a view or a type. I've struggled for the correct terminology here, but in essence, it's a grouping. It's not a view, which only connotes the visual aspect of the sound tiles. And it's not really a type, which has special connotations in the .NET world. A sound group has a title that'll be used to display the title of the pivot item in the pivot control on the main page.xaml. And it also has that generic collection of sound data. The sound data class represents the sounds themselves. Each instance of sound data will be displayed in a tile, and by tapping the tile, we're going to play the sound that's associated with the sound data as it's stored in the file path property, right? So given this clarity, it's time to implement the diagram we see here in C# code. I'm sure that there's going to be a few additions as we go along, but this is a good start in the right direction, I think. So let's go ahead and we're going to create the new data model classes for our app. We have a plan and we have our data model diagram in tow. So we're going to begin implementing that new data model. So to do that, what I want to do is go to the View Models folder, and I'm going to use that folder, repurpose it for our new view model. And I'm going to select, right-click it and select Add New Item. And I want to make sure that I'm in the C# templates, and I want to choose the class, and we're going to call this class Sound Data. Click OK or Add. And it's loaded in the main area, and what I want to do is add two public properties per our diagram. So I'm going to go prop tab tab, in this case, string title, enter, enter, and then prop tab tab, string tab tab, file path, enter, enter. All right, so there are my two public properties. And now I want to add another item, another add new item, and this time I want to call this class, I'll call it sound group, and click add. And the very first thing we want to do in the sound group, I'm going to actually make it a public class, and I probably should do that for sound data as well before I forget. There we go. All right, and what I want to do here is I'm going to create a constructor called public sound group, and we'll also create prop tab. We're going to do a list of sound data called items, and then another string called title, right? And then here what I want to do in the constructor is create a new instance of the list of sound data. So I'm going to set items equal new list of sound data, like so. Great. Whoops. And I can see I named things differently. Just make sure that they all match up there. Items, items. Okay, we're good to go. Nice. Okay, and then we're going to add one more class to the View Models folder. Right-click, select Add New Item, and this class will be called the Sound Model. It'll be the topmost class in our hierarchy. It'll contain a sound group for each of the view or the categories of sounds that we're going to display in our app, the groupings, all right? It'll also implement the logic to determine whether data has already been loaded into the new data model, and it's going to have the vast majority of code to create instances of the sound data classes for each sound that we want to use in our app, just like we saw in the main view model with its isDataLoaded property and the load data that we talked about 2 lessons ago, right? So we're going to kind of duplicate that here, but with our own data. Okay, so we're going to start simple, and then we're going to grow this important class out throughout the rest of this lesson, the next couple of lessons. All right, so to begin, let's just get going here with, we'll make this public. Very good. And then we're going to go prop tab. I'm going to make a sound group called custom sounds. Prop tab sound group animals. Prop tab sound group tab cartoons. Enter. Prop tab sound group, and we're just going to keep following that. Taunts. Sound group warnings. I think that's the last one. Okay, then we're going to need that isDataLoaded. So prop bool isDataLoaded. And then finally what I want to do is create a method, public void load data. And this is where we're going to do where all the magic happens. And so let me just for now put a little placeholder here, load data into the model, because we're going to have to come back to that and do a lot of work there later in another lesson. But when it is called, we'll say the data is loaded equal true. Okay, great. So before we perform the bulk of the work in the load data method, and what we'll do is probably create some helper methods to help with the heavy lifting so that we don't have like a method that's just a bajillion lines long, right? We want it to keep things a little bit smaller. What I want to do is replace the old data model that's being used by the project template. I want to replace it in the app with the new one that we just created by changing the class that the app.xaml.cs uses to back its view model property. So first I'm going to comment out the references to the old model in the app.xaml.cs. And I typically comment things out that I no longer think I need before I actually delete them from the project. This is a habit that I've acquired through the years. I've hastily deleted code thinking, I don't need it, I'll replace it later, only to realize that there was some small detail that I was missing. However, since I deleted the old working version and I can no longer reference it, it becomes more time consuming and painful to determine where I made the mistake. So here I'm going to comment out the implementation of the main view model property. So here, and both the private backing field as well as the public getter and setter. So what I'll do is I'm going to start here with a multi-line comment and close the multi-line comment. So now that's gone. Great. And next I'm going to implement the new version of the view model using our new data model type sound model. So here we go. Make some room for ourselves. Private, and we'll make this static. So we only need one instance, or we don't even need an instance of this, right? It's just, it'll be created without instance. And then we'll go public static sound model, view model. Whoops, we gotta name it with a capital V for view model because it's gonna be public. And then we'll create our getter. And I don't think we need a setter, right? So if view model equals null, then view model equals new sound model, sound model, and return the view model. Great. All right, it's not happy about something here. Because I didn't comment out this line of code there. So we need to comment out the old private version as well as the public property so that when we create the new one, this will work correctly. All right, got that? Very good. So that's all that should be required. References to the sound models is data loaded and load data method now should work fine. They're now pointing here instead of the old place where they were pointing in our main view model. Great. Now that I've removed the old data model from the app, I'm sure that I've broken several other things. But at this moment, I'm most concerned about the XAML view here in the designer. The binding expressions are pointing at properties that no longer exist. So you might say, well, okay, we've eliminated it. Any references to the old main view model here in the app.xaml.cs, why does this still display correctly in the XAML editor? Well, that's because at design time, this data context is pulling only from this main view model sample data. All right, so once we remove this reference, it's all going to collapse on us. So that's our next order of business, is to take some time to kind of massage all this back into working form and to replace this design time data file with our own version. And so I'm going to have to do this in small chunks. My first priority is to make some design time data available so that I can then edit the XAML views here by using the XAML editor and the designer and visually see feedback about the changes that I'm making. All right. So what I want to do is right click in the sample data folder and select add new item. And I want to add a Windows Phone portrait page. Now we're only just using this because it's a XAML page, and we'll add data to it. We're not worried about the visual designer of it, as you'll see here in a minute. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to remove everything about this file that makes it a XAML page. So I'm just going to select it all, including phone application page, and just delete it all. And when I do that, and if I were to save, you'll see that the editor will get confused here in a minute. Yeah, and it says invalid markup, right? So that's fine. And what I want to do now is I want to add my own XAML that will comprise sample data for the app. Before I do that, however, let me go, and I want to drill down, because by default you get this sample data.xaml.cs file, and I just want to delete that as well. We don't need a code behind for this. Again, the only reason we're using a XAML file is so that we can bind to it at design time. All right, so back here in the sample data.xaml file, I'm going to hide the visual designer completely, just move it off the screen like that. And I need to add quite a bit of code in this file, in the sample data.xaml file. Now, there's a couple of things that we could do here, but I don't want to take the time to type all this out, and it's just going to be a typing exercise. So I've made available this file, and I've happened to add it, unzip it here to my desktop. Just make sure that you find this file wherever you currently are viewing this video or downloaded these videos from originally. I may even put them here in the download for the entire project with all the assets and everything. There also will be a code listing, and you can just below this video where you're currently viewing the embedded version, you can just select it all, copy and paste it in your project. For my purposes, I'm going to right click this and select Open With, and in Windows 8 it'll give me just a couple of options, but I'm going to click More Options in order to select Notepad, and so I can see this whole thing, this whole file in Notepad. You can see that we get a sound model, and we're calling its animals, its cartoons property, its taunts property, which is essentially just containing a sound group item, and each sound group will then have a collection called items with individual sound data instances. So I want to copy this whole thing. I hit Control A on my keyboard, Control C, go back into Visual Studio, and then I'm just going to paste this whole thing in here, and you can see it show up correct. And you might get this blue squiggly, but I suspect that's because we haven't compiled our app just yet, and once we compile it, it'll find the proper namespace for the new classes that we've created. Let me just make sure that they are indeed in the correct namespace. That one's correct, that one's correct, and that one's correct. So I suspect that this will resolve itself after we, build the solution. We might find other errors in the build. Now it looks like it succeeded. So now when we go back to sample data.xaml, it clears up all the blue squigglies. All right, very good. And so I think it's important here to see, well, why are we prefixing, the word sound model with the letter VM? Again, because we declare that namespace reference of VM to the CLR namespace of soundboard.viewModels, which is where sound model, sound group, and sound data, the namespace that they belong to. Okay, that's the only reason that exists. The rest are just for so that this XAML can be represented correctly, like we talked about very early on in the series of videos with the namespaces. Okay, so moving on here, what I want to do is now use this new sample data in my main page.xaml. And to do that, I'm going to go to my main page.xaml file, and I want to look for this design time data context. So the D, again, indicates that namespace that would allow us to use the XAML at design time. And remember, the next line, this OpenXML formats, it makes that XAML prefixed with the letter D ignorable at runtime, but at design time, we're able to use it to set the data context to this sample data / main view model sample data.xaml. So all we need to do here is just remove this like so, and now we have reset the data context for our pivots to the sample data.xaml that we just created. Now everything disappears, you can see, in our XAML designer, but that's okay. The reason why everything is gone is because we no longer have items, and no longer do they bind to line 1 and line 2 attributes of the items that they're binding to. Okay, so we're going to need to change some things about this. So the first thing we're going to want to do in our first pivot is I'm going to change this binding expression from items to animals.items. And then I'm going to change the binding here for the text block 1 to title and file path, which I know to be properties on our sound data class. And when I do that, notice that now we can now see animals1 and animals.wave. These are both from our sample data for the animals sound group. Okay? Let me also change this header. Currently it says the word first, but I can change that to a binding expression. Binding to animals.title. Awesome. And you can see it changed from the word first to the word animals. So how do we get to animals here? Well, just to be clear, animals is a public property of sound model, which is the parent class that's defined here in our sample data.xaml file, which we set as the data context for the entire main page.xaml. Therefore, every child property of the sound model in that file are accessible. So animals and cartoons and taunts and the other ones that we created as well. All right, since the long list selectors item source attribute is set to animals.items, and items is a list of sound data, we can therefore reference any property in the sound data class inside of the data template. So I set the text attribute to the title property of the sound data class and the file path property of the sound data class. And then I set the header in the binding of the pivot item to animals.title. Again, I can reference animals because its parent, the sound model, is set as the data context for the entire main page.xaml. All right. In the XAML designer, we now see what it will look like, at least for this first pivot item. Very cool. And so hopefully you can see the correlation between the main page.xaml's controls and the sample data for animals, like you see, here, like we talked about a moment ago. We made a change to the first pivot item, and now what we want to do is change the second pivot item to display the sound group cartoons. And so what we're going to do, you'll see that it's practically identical to what we wrote for animals. So I'm simply going to go here to the pivot item. I'm going to copy everything about that pivot item. Control C on my keyboard once I have the entire open and close pivot item selected. And I'm going to go and replace this pivot item. And then all I'm going to do is change from animals, everywhere it says animals in pivot item 2, to cartoon. Cartoons, I think, right? And here again, cartoons.items. And the title and the file path should be the same. And now we see cartoons 1 and cartoons 2. And if we compare that to what we see in the sample data.xaml, that's exactly what we see as the two items there. And the title is cartoon sample. Let's see if that shows up. Yep, cartoon sample here at the very top in the pivot items title. Okay. And so now when I put my mouse cursor either in the pivot item 2 or pivot item 1, notice that it changes which pivot is currently being displayed here in the main area. Very cool. Okay, so I think that's enough for this lesson. To recap, the big takeaway in this lesson is how we replace the default data model and the sample data in the pivot project template with our own new data model for working with groups of sounds, and I'm bound to the new sample data by modifying the main page.xaml's page and control declarations. We learned about data contexts and how they're set and accessed from within the page, like we did when we changed it right here. Okay, so hopefully that all made sense. At least you can see the correlations of how everything is related. And so we're just going to continue on with these sorts of modifications for the next couple of lessons. We'll see you there. Thank you.